PDF copy. There's no reference.
Right, we're going to get started again with our next speaker, François Raffoul, Professor of Philosophy and French Studies at Louisiana State University. François Raffoul holds a doctorate in philosophy from the UHESS, where he wrote a dissertation under the direction of Jacques Derrida. He's published extensively on Heidegger, Derrida, and contemporary continental philosophy. He is the author, well, not most recently, because there's a new update as of this morning, but recent books include The Origins of Responsibility with Indiana University. He's also the co-editor recently of the Bloomsbury Companion to Heidegger and French Interpretations of Heidegger, An Exceptional Reception. This was SUNY. François Raffoul, I'd like to mention, has also translated a number of books and essays, including work by Derrida, Heidegger, Nancy, as well as, I think, relevant to today's events, Dominique Janico's book, Heidegger in France. And I've just learned that there's a new book coming out with Indiana, Thinking the Event. And the title of his talk today is Sexual Difference in Gathering in Geschlecht III. Please welcome François Raffoul.
Thank you, Kelly, for inviting me to this wonderful lecture conference, where we go as well. Excuse me if I cough at times. You can see I have a cold, but I think I will gather it. So I'd like to speak today about the question of sexual difference, since this came up, it's timely, and gathering in the heretofore unpublished and recently available essay by Jacques Derrida, Geschlecht III. The importance of this third volume in the Geschlecht series cannot be underestimated. In a note at the very beginning of Geschlecht I, an essay that treated of sexual difference in Heidegger's 1928 course, The Metaphysical Foundations of Logic, Derrida stated that his work on the senses of the term Geschlecht in Heidegger's work was magnetized by the perspective of Geschlecht III, a text that itself focuses on Heidegger's 1953 essay on Trakel, language and the poem, a situation of George Trakel's poetic work. In Geschlecht III, Derrida echoes that statement and stressed that the first essay I had attempted under the title of Geschlecht was for the most part concerned with the 1928 text, and mentioned that date in the first line. It announced an approach of the 1953 text, Geschlecht III. Derrida recognizes at the beginning of Geschlecht III that although one cannot establish stricto sensu an evolution between the 1928 course and the 1953 essay, one can still discern between them a relation, a rapport. He says, if I emphasize these two stations or sites, it is because I intend to clarify some relation. Now that relation is in fact the question of sexual difference, as Derrida considers the 1953 essay to be, quote, a great discourse on sexual difference. In Geschlecht III, sexual difference is referred to a fold or twofoldness that precedes the opposition of sexual duality. A duality which, according to Derrida, neutralizes sexual difference. In a dialogue with Christy MacDonald, Derrida already explained early on, one could, I think, demonstrate this. When sexual difference is determined by opposition in the dialectical sense, one appears to set off the war between the sexes. But one precipitates the end with victory going to the masculine sex. The determination of sexual difference in opposition is destined, in truth, for truth. It is so in order to erase sexual difference. End quote. Derrida's reading in Geschlecht III thus follows the thread of sexual difference, a reading that is itself magnetized, to use Derrida's word, aimanté, by what he termed the dream of another sexual difference, one that precisely would not be ruled by the opposition of the two. Derrida writes, what if we were to approach here, for one does not arrive at this as one would at a determined location, the area of a relationship to the other where the code of sexual marks would no longer be discriminating. The relationship would not be asexual, far from it, but would be sexual otherwise, beyond the binary difference that governs the decorum codes, beyond the opposition feminine-masculine, beyond bisexuality as well, beyond homosexuality and heterosexuality, which come to the same thing. As I dream of setting the chance that this question offers, I would like to believe in the multiplicity of sexually marked voices. I would like to believe in the masses, the indeterminable numbers of blended voices, this mobile of non-identified sexual marks, whose choreography can carry, divide, multiply the body of each individual, whether he be classified as man or as a woman, according to the criteria of usage. Excuse me for the long citation. Derrida clarifies that in the Marburg course, 1928, the word Geschlecht was always very precisely determined by the context and assigned not only to sexuality but to sexuality divided in two. Here in Geschlecht III, he writes in Geschlecht III, the division determines Geschlecht. One will have to think in parallel with the poet a certain unity, or rather the one of Geschlecht, that would neither yet be unisexuality nor sexual indifferentiation or equivalence. Now, with respect to such unity, to the one of Geschlecht, Derrida's leading interpretation is his view that Heidegger privileges gathering in his thinking of difference, and of sexual difference in particular. Indeed, for Derrida, gathering, Versammlung, quote, governs the meditation of Geschlecht in the text on Trago, orienting the thinking of sexual difference in terms of a gathering towards the one, thereby neutralizing difference. So I will attempt in what follows to discuss and present Derrida's reading, and at times I will attempt to raise some questions myself concerning his questions or his interpretations of Heidegger with respect to this issue of gathering. Now in the first part I'm going to briefly resituate what was open in Geschlecht 1 and the reading of that 1928 course. The question of sexual difference, of which Derrida treats in Geschlecht 1, appears in Heidegger's 1928 course, The Metaphysical Foundations of Logic, in the course of an analysis of neutral Dasein. Now, the notion of neutrality corresponds to Heidegger's attempt to neutralize any ontic or anthropocentric features so as to allow for a strictly ontological analysis of Dasein. The first neutralization is of the very term man, that is, the anthropological approach. Heidegger writes, the term man, Mensch, was not used for that being, which is the theme of the analysis. Instead, the neutral term das Dasein was chosen. End quote. And Heidegger adds, the peculiar neutrality of the term Dasein is essential because the interpretation of this being must be carried out prior to every factual concretion. End quote. Now, the first and only example, in fact, given by Heidegger of such factual concretion, of all possible examples, is sexual difference. A motif that he does not often evoke, although the more I look, the more I find places, so it's not maybe not that rare. I have 3 places, one better than Grundes, in what is called Thinking, in Introduction to Philosophy, 1920-29. So you can see still some marks in the text. Heidegger writes the following. This neutrality also indicates that Dasein is neither of the two sexes. Neutrality, Derrida explains or comments, is understood in the direction of sexual neutrality and even of a certain sexlessness of being there. That's in Geschlecht 1. In Geschlecht 1, Derrida takes issue with Heidegger's ontological neutralization, which seemed to simply remove sexuality from the very definition of the human being. It is as if the ontological difference cancelled the sexual difference, as if, Derrida writes, sexual difference did not rise to the height of ontological difference. As if, in other words, sexual difference was negligible and negligible for thought, an ontic predicate left to the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, biology, psychoanalysis. Derrida notes a twofold assumption in Heidegger's text. First, the fact that sexuality is privileged, as an example of concretion, but not really justified by Heidegger. Second, the fact that Heidegger assumes that sexual difference is binary, governed by the two. So Heidegger writes, Derrida writes, I'm going to make that mistake often, I think. The first example of concretion would then be the belonging to one or the other of the sexes. Heidegger does not doubt that there are two. This duality in sexuality is, of course, a central motif in Geschlecht III. In fact, it is not, we should say from the outset, it is not sexuality as such which is neutralized in Heidegger's ontological analysis, but sexual duality. Neutral Dasein, we are told, is, quote, neither one of the two sexes, which doesn't mean that Dasein is asexual or sexless. Rather, it means that neutral Dasein is not sexually differentiated into either of the two sexes. Heidegger clarifies the following. But here, sexlessness is not the indifference of an empty void, the weak negativity of an indifferent nothing. In its neutrality, Dasein is not the indifferent nobody and everybody, but the primordial positivity and potency of the essence. Sexual neutrality is thus not asexuality, but what we may call a pre-dual sexuality. Quote, pre-differential, or rather pre-dual sexuality, which, as Derrida continues, does not necessarily mean unitary, homogeneous, and undifferentiated, but a sexuality that is more originary than the dyad, and which would be the positive and powerful source of every possible sexuality, as Derrida. One should add here that there might be indeed this sexual difference as a pre-dual sexuality. For Heidegger states, which is a fascinating development in that text, that there belongs to neutral Dasein a primordial dispersion. Now that's another rare occurrence in Heidegger, where Dasein is said to be originally dispersed. Usually you always focus on the notion of a unified Dasein. For instance, in Being and Time, the notion of authentic Dasein is always in terms of a certain unity of my whole being, right, as towards death. But here, Heidegger and Derrida talks about dissemination, dispersion, Verströmheit, Strömt, and neutral Dasein is referred to even a transcendental principle, that of a bistro. Heidegger writes, in other words, in his metaphysical neutral concept, Dasein's essence already contains a primordial bestroual, which is in quite a definite respect a dissemination. That's Troy. So one could think here Heidegger as a thinker of dissemination in this text. Now, interestingly, this transcendental dispersion, which then affects original Dasein, is what accounts for Dasein's sexual difference. Heidegger writes, as such, Dasein harbors the intrinsic possibility for being factically dispersed into bodiliness and thus into sexuality, end quote. It also includes, it also provides an account of being with, because later on in the text, Heidegger says that being with must be accounted for in terms of this dispersion. So dispersion sort of structures our being with, our sexuality, which also comes out of being with, because there's no sexuality except in terms of being with, and a bodiliness as such. Neutrality in Heidegger thus includes a certain sexual difference or dispersion, which is indeed pre-dual. Heidegger continued, as factical Dasein is among other things, in each case dispersed in a body, and concomitantly, among other things, in each case disunited in a particular sexuality. Now, it is this opening to a pre-dual sexual dispersion, multiplication or dissemination, that interests Derrida, as it opens the space for that other sexual difference of which he is dreaming. It is a matter of thinking, he writes, a sexual difference that would not yet be sexual duality, difference as dual. As we have already observed, what the lectures neutralized was less sexuality itself than the generic mark of sexual difference, belonging to one of the two sexes. Hence, in leading back to dispersion and multiplication, might one not begin to think of a sexual difference with a negativity, let us be clear, that would not be sealed by the two? The retreat of the dyad leads to the other sexual difference, end quote. Now, it is such sexual difference which he explored in Geschlecht III, and which he presents in Geschlecht I in these terms. In the lectures, for the reason given above, Geschlecht always names sexuality as such as it is rendered by opposition by the dual. Later and earlier matters will be difference, and this opposition is called decomposition. Following Trakl, dual sexuality is characterized as cursed, a state of decomposition or disincensing, leading to the form of difference as discord, Spitrat. So let me move now to Geschlecht III. Sexual difference, which was approached in Geschlecht I in terms of its relation to ontological difference and neutral Dasein, is pursued in Geschlecht III via a reflection on duality, dissemination, discord, and gathering. Commenting on Trakl in the 1953 essay, Heidegger presents sexual duality as a decomposed or disincensed form of humanity. The curse afflicting humanity is a division between sexes, the discord between them. Not duality as such, Heidegger writes, the discord is the curse. This latter phrase harbors for Derrida the entire enigma of the essay, as well as the guiding thread between Geschlecht I and Geschlecht III. The sentence he writes carries the force and enigma of the text, an enigma whose premises, he continues, I had attempted to indicate in the 1928 Marburg lectures. Now, the dissension, the discord between the sexes is the curse. It is a discord that comes out of an exasperated duality between the sexes that turns into a war of the sexes, although, as Derrida clarifies, the discord, the dual, is the becoming war of a duality or duplicity that it, not itself, is not cursed. A sort of a particular fate of difference. It is not sexual difference that is cursed, only what determines it as duality, war or discord, what splits it in two. One will then have to differentiate between two types of difference as discord, dissension, Derrida writes, and difference as twofoldness, to which I will return. The first cursed difference leads each sex into the unleashed turmoil of the always isolated, into an unleashed individuation without relation, splitting open a difference into a division and a discord, leading the sexes to war, to separation in war. Derrida interprets as follows: unleashed, both unbridled and absolved from everything, from any commitment and association, disseminated. Discord carries each kind into an irreconcilable split and so casted into unbridled isolation. The sexes become fragmented, isolated, decomposed. The each becomes exasperated and isolated instead of engaged in a relation with the other, each, in a pacified difference as twofoldness. Cursed difference becomes violence. Individuation is here understood in terms of isolation and violence. Or, on the other hand, it can find its proper site in the fold of a relation to the other sex, in a so-called gentle difference. The gentle or simple twofoldness. There is therefore, as François Dastur notes in an essay on Heidegger and Trakl, a good and a malignant way of experiencing individuation, the becoming one. The good one is attentive to the strangeness of duplication and its dynamic character, accepting the duality of species in the gentleness of a simple twofoldness. Now, a simple twofoldness, this does not mean a simple simplicity. It is not simplicity as opposed to duality. The term simple is used here as an adjective qualifying twofoldness. A strange expression indeed, as Derrida comments, a singular paradox, the simplicity of a difference, a simple duality, a simple twofold. Derrida writes, simplicity in the two of difference, a strange thing, properly unheard of, the discretion of inaudibility, strange like the simplicity of duplicity, the one fold of the two double fold, or the without fold of the fold. The separation of the sexes become dynamic, each one intertwined or interlaced with the other, or rather folded together, a togetherness that is itself at once a separation, in a gentle difference, It is a gentle difference in which the one is not opposed to the two, and Derrida writes, and in truth cannot even be distinguished from it. Indeed, although separate, individuation is not cast as an isolated state, but remains in relation with the other, so that while being distinct, the one is never without the other one, it is with and without it. This is what the expression of simple twofoldness suggests. Discord becomes twofoldness. Oppositional sexuality is returned to the gentleness, peace, and tenderness of a pre-dual folded difference, a return to the stillness of childhood. The two of discord, Derrida writes, is transfigured according to the promise of a two without war, prefiguring the couple of the tender sexual difference between brother and sister. Unquote. This motif of childhood, of this serene state, which is prior to the discord of decomposed species, rejoins with the neutrality of pre-sexual Dasein in the 1928 course. For what is the child? And this is a citation from Dastur. The child is the one in whom the duality of sexes has not yet become dissension or discord, the one referred to in German in the neuter, and who harbors and shelters within the tender fold of the sexes. It would then seem here that the critique of dual sexuality may open the way to another experience of sexual difference. Now, it is at this point, however, that Derrida takes issue with what he considers to be a reduction in Heidegger's text of this difference to the unifying point of a gathering, to the value of the simple and the one, exposing a différent with Heidegger between what may call a folded, gathered, or perhaps bound difference on the one hand, and dissemination, dispersion, or difference on the other. Heidegger cites a verse in which Raffoul mentions one's Geschlecht. We talked about it yesterday and today. Ein Geschlecht. And Heidegger notes how the one is emphasized. Quote, then follows the simple phrase one Geschlecht. The word one is stressed. As far as I can see, it is the only word so stressed in Raffoul's work. This emphatic one Geschlecht contains the keynote in which Raffoul's poetic work silently sounds the mystery. Unquote. In fact, the stressed ein is, as we heard yesterday, spaced in Raffoul's poem, a spacing that, as it were, prefigures or makes room for a certain difference, if not difference. So we have here the graphic of spaced differential one announcing itself in the very writing of it. Now, Derrida interprets this reference to a one, as I mentioned, in terms of this privilege of gathering in Heidegger's thought as a whole. Evoking the fundamental tonality of Raffoul's poetical work, Derrida writes, it is this very fundamental tonality, this very unity that Heidegger wants to hear in the ein of ein Geschlecht. One can say it at the outset. In his Gespräch with Raffoul, Heidegger is guided by the prior understanding or listening of this ein in ein Geschlecht. Such would have been the sight. Unquote. So I'm moving to my last part on gathering. The reference to simplicity or oneness is suspected by Derrida as confirming Heidegger's privilege of gathering. For Derrida, gathering, Versammlung, quote, governs the meditation of Geschlecht in the text on Raffoul. The motif of gathering is, of course, and has always been a fundamental place of contention between Derrida and Heidegger in all of Derrida's readings, and in particular in Geschlecht III. In Geschlecht II, Derrida stated, quote, that it is always the gathering that Heidegger privileges. Derrida explains this claim in the following way. As you know, deconstruction owed a lot to Heidegger. Nevertheless, one of the recurrent critiques or deconstructive questions I pose to Heidegger has to do with the privilege Heidegger grants to what he calls Versammlung, gathering, which is always more powerful than dissociation. I would say exactly the opposite. This is Derrida. Once you grant some privilege to gathering and not to dissociating, then you leave no room for the radical otherness of the other, for the radical singularity of the other. Unquote. Now, before returning to this question and to the question of the site as site of gathering, Let us indicate from the outset that Heidegger is careful to clarify immediately in the text that the one in one Geschlecht does not mean one as opposed to two. The one is not opposed to the two, but belongs with it in the gentle twofoldness. Such oneness, Heidegger writes, gathers together and unfolds the discord of the generation into a gentler twofold. The word Geschlecht, Heidegger puts it, always refers to the twofoldness of the sexes. This is why the one is not the monotony of dull equality, does not refer to a single or identical gender. We saw that for Derrida, Heidegger always privileges gathering, meaning unity. In fact, in Heidegger's work, it is hard to find a notion that would present an established unit or unity. We can discuss that. One perhaps should say instead that there is a unifying movement, not a unity, a unifying movement, which gathers what? A multiplicity and a dispersion. In fact, Derrida recognizes this in Geschlecht III. I'll give you the French first. D'ailleurs, cette unité du un n'est pas donnée. The unity of the one is not given. Ce n'est pas un fait ou une donnée. It's not a fact or a given. C'est un mouvement, it is a motion, une motion, on dirait. Il n'y a pas l'un ou l'unité du un, il y a le mouvement d'unir. There is not a one or unity of the one, there is the motion of unifying. In fact, Derrida even corrects the French translator, Beaufret, who mistakenly renders Jenes Einende by unity instead of unifying. So that means that the one does not refer to some established or posited unity somewhere, but rather is one of gathering, unifying. And gathering can only be the holding, keeping, or safeguarding of difference and multiplicity. As we said yesterday, we heard that yesterday, I think from your paper, if I remember, gathering supposed prior dispersion. And if there was such a unity, there would be no gathering. There would be no need for gathering if there were unity. So gathering supposes dispersion and not unity. I would propose to counter Derrida's interpretation here in general. This also means the following. The one is never without difference. Never without a relation to the two. It is what Heidegger called in Disparture, 1950, the tear and threshold of difference, or the between. I read this passage from Disparture of Language. It's a passage on pain as threshold of difference, as the tear or juncture of difference, and I would call it the one, the trait lunaire of difference, right? The stretching of difference. But what is pain, Heidegger writes? Pain tears. It is the rift, but it does not tear apart into dispersive fragments. Pain indeed tears apart, it separates, yet so that at the same time it draws everything to itself and gathers it to itself. So in other words, the separating is the gathering, and the gathering is the separating. And that's what the holding of difference means. Its tearing as a separating that gathers, as a separating that gathers, is at the same time the drawing that sketches out and joins together what is held apart in separation. Pain is the joining agent in the tear that divides and gathers. So now Heidegger thinks together, dividing and gathering. They become almost together. Pain is the juncture of the tear. It is the threshold. It settles the between, the middle of the two that are separated in it. Pain joins the tear and the difference. Pain is the difference itself, Winterschiff. Tears and divides. The tearing then is a gathering. Its gathering is the gathering of the tear. And gathering is not, therefore, the overcoming of difference under some unity that would pre-exist it. The one that we're talking about is the one of the difference, not the one prior or apart from it. Hence, again, simple twofoldness. Another way of hearing that expression. In the 1968 Tour seminar, held in France with Beaufray and others, Fédier and all the French Heideggerians, Heidegger discusses an expression from Hegel, according to which, quote, a torn sock is better than a mended one, unquote. Heidegger then proceeds to give a phenomenological account of the notion of tearing, and tearing apart. So he writes, quote, to tear apart means to tear into two parts, to separate, to make two out of one. In other words, what is lacking in the torn sock is the unity of the sock, unquote. What matters is this. The tear remains in the work of unification of philosophy. Quote, in the conjoining, insofar as the work of the absolute, the oppositions do not disappear, unquote. Then Heidegger, interestingly for our purpose here, rejects the notion of a unity beneath the tear. He writes, or says, philosophy is not a piecing together, and if the tear or the tearing is necessary, then can one speak of a unity before the tearing? Well, obviously the answer is no to this rhetorical question. The unity here is the one of the tear again, irreducibly split. It is to that extent, and for that reason, that Heidegger says that the word Geschlecht here retains, even after the discussion of ein Geschlecht, here retains the full manifold meaning mentioned earlier, the polysemy we talked about yesterday. So let me say a word about this polysemy after a great talk yesterday on that, very illuminating. Heidegger indeed writes of the multiple ambiguousness of Trakell's poetic saying, how the poetic work speaks out of an ambiguousness. Derrida insists that for Heidegger there is no poetic saying unless polysemy is gathered in a grundton that originates in a unique site, unique and gathering. Unquote. Now, Heidegger resolutely affirms here and in other places an essential polysemy and multiplicity of thought, and explicitly rejects the ideal of unicity and identity in meaning. In what is called thinking, we read the following passage. Heidegger explains and writes that multiplicity is the very element of thought. Quote, there is no universal schema, he writes, which could be applied mechanically to the interpretation of the writings of thinkers, or even to a single work of a single thinker. A dialogue of Plato, the Phaedrus, for example, the Conversation on Beauty, can be interpreted in totally different spheres and respects, according to totally different implications and problematics. This multiplicity of possible interpretation, he continues, does not discredit the rigor of the thought content. For all true thought remains open to more than one interpretation, and this by reason of its nature. Nor is this multiplicity of possible interpretations merely the residue of a still unachieved formal logical univocity, which we properly ought to strive for but did not attain. Rather, multiplicity of meanings is the element, he writes, in which all thought must move in order to be rigorous thought. Polysemy then is presented in this course, what is called thinking, in the element of thought. And Heidegger writes and adds, just as to a fish, the depth and expanses of its waters, the currents and quiet pools, warm and cold layers are the element of its multiple mobility. So we are like a fish in water in polysemy, according to Heidegger. Now it is true that Heidegger nonetheless adds in the Trakell essay, that Derrida of course emphasizes, that this ambiguous polysemy does not scatter in vague equivocations, is not lax imprecision, precisely because the ambiguous tone of Trakell's poetry, quote, arises out of gathering, a claim with which Derrida takes issue. For Derrida contrasts the polysemy of which Heidegger speaks even irreducible with dispersion and dissemination. Well, I'm not going to go over that again because we talked about that at length yesterday, this contrast made by Derrida. But Derrida says something very interesting in this respect in a 2000 interview with Dominique Janicot, which is in the Heidegger in France volume. And I read what Derrida says. It's an interesting account of gathering and his relation to Heidegger. Quote, I am on the side of dislocation, of dispersion, of dissemination. It would be unfair and a simplification to say that Heidegger negates difference, dislocation, or dissemination. One could have a reading of Heidegger that would show that he does think dislocation. But there is a force, and he does that constantly, he recognizes that, but still. But, Derrida continues, there is a force that draws him towards gathering, towards being near oneself. The difficulty is one of knowing whether one can think Versammlung while including in it, integrating and assimilating into it the play of difference, of dislocation, of dissociation, or whether it is only to the extent that there is an irreducible risk of dispersion, singularity, or dissemination, then Versammlung can emerge. So this is the debate that we have in here. But Derrida continues with his opposition. Here he says the stress is instead on the side of alterity, of dissociation, of infinite distance, of dispersion, of the incomprehensible, of the impossible, and of destinerance. The logic of gathering represents, he said, the blindness to the other, and can become complicitous with the worst in terms of political expression, whereas the side of dissociation is the best opportunity. Derrida concludes on this point, still in this interview with Janicot, I resist gathering in the name of what no longer allows itself to be gathered. Alas. Alas and no, in fact, because the fact of resisting the gathering might be felt as a distress, a sadness, a loss, dislocation, dissemination, the not being at home, etc. But it is also an opportunity. It is the opportunity of an encounter, of justice, of a relation to absolute alterity, end quote. Now, I'm going to close on a discussion of the notion of sight in Heidegger, in Derrida's reading of Heidegger. Sort of the last section. The debate on gathering comes to a head in Geschlecht III in Derrida's discussion of the subtitle of Heidegger's 1953 essay, and Erörterung, and specifically of the term Erörterung discussion, but also placement of situation, or more precisely, a localization of Treichroth's poetical work. Derrida stresses that Heidegger thinks the side as gathering, and indeed we read at the beginning of the essay the following. Originally, the word sight signifies the point of a sphere in which everything comes together, is concentrated. The side gathers unto itself, supremely and in the extreme. The side, the gathering power, gathers in and preserves all that it has gathered. Derrida questioned this reference to gathering in Heidegger's thought of the side. He writes, if the side is regularly and typically defined by gathering, our whole approach of the Heideggerian gesture will have to question this privilege of gathering and everything it implies. Now, this gathering is around a point, Derrida says, which he calls the indivisible point of the sphere, that Heidegger retrieves from the etymology of the word earth in Erörterung, an indivisible point to which all differences will be referred. When Heidegger says that every great poet creates his poetry out of one single poetic statement, Derrida interprets the singularity and simplicity as the position of an indivisible point. Derrida writes, the unique marks the site in its indivisible singularity, the absolute and inimitable property of an idiom, end quote. Now, Derrida immediately recognizes that Heidegger does not use the word indivisible, would not use it, never uses it, and the word is essentially foreign to Heidegger's thought. He even says Heidegger probably would have protested against it. So, this is what Derrida said. No doubt, Heidegger would have protested against the word indivisible. He would have protested for two reasons. So he's going to develop why the word doesn't hold. He would have said, I imagine that unity, simplicity, unicity, and gathering, all terms to which he defines the site and the Geschlecht, are not indivisible. If the word indivisible tends to refer to the geometrical objective contrariety of an extension, or the instantaneity of a likewise objective time. Unquote. The second protest, because Derrida continues undermining his own interpretation, then, it seems, would have consisted in saying that the point of the sphere is not some indivisible point, precisely because the site itself is not indivisible. He would have said, meaning Heidegger, according to Derrida's imagination, he would have said that in fact, quote, the site can divide itself, dissociate itself, and even disseminate and decompose itself, unquote. So for all those reasons, Heidegger would not say that the site is indivisible. And yet Derrida insists on using the term indivisible for the following reason that he gives us. If it is the place to speak of the site, the French is s'il y a lieu de parler du lieu. I struggle with that. Maybe we can talk how to translate that. But for now, I'm going to say if it is the place to speak of the site. So s'il y a lieu de parler du lieu. If one desires the site, there's the word desire coming up. If one is in motion towards the site, then gathering, the motion of gathering must prevail over the disseminating forces. So again, you see the opposition between gathering and dissemination through the notion of indivisibility. Heidegger, then, we are told, is in motion towards the site, desires the site, and a few lines below, nonetheless, after having emphasized against Heidegger, it would seem, the divisibility of the site, Derrida writes the following. This accident, here divisibility, is not an evil, a simple evil. There would be no place, desire, or movement towards or from the site of gathering if this divisibility was excluded or external. In other words, for there to be a desire for the site must be divisible. But Heidegger desires the site. So how could the site be indivisible if he desires the site? It has to be divisible. In other words, divisibility, and not indivisibility, but divisibility, turns out to be the condition for the site. And thus, we may add, for gathering itself. Divisibility becomes, in Derrida's words, the condition of possibility and impossibility of the site. Quote, if visibility is thus the essential condition of possibility and impossibility of desire for the site, here of the Geschlecht. So, it is thus the essential condition of possibility and impossibility of desire of the site, here of the Geschlecht. For inversely, if the site of the letter were indivisible, not affected by dissociation, difference, etc., there would be no movement, and there's no site or letter, no Geschlecht, and no dictum. So this law, this aporetic law, applies to Heidegger. From the position of an indivisible point, Heidegger's text testifies to a movement towards, if not a desire for the site, a movement that precisely requires difference, division, and divisibility. So when Heidegger discusses Strachel's verse, something strange is the soul on earth, he connects the strange to the old High German Fremd, which has the meaning of forward to somewhere else, underway towards. The strange is a journey towards the site. And the site, in turn, is what the journeying seeks. Homecoming is a journeying in the foreign, a journey that is the traversal of difference, but not the reduction to an indivisible point. The site is indeed divisible and marked by difference. This is why gathering is not the reduction of difference, but its safeguarding, as Heidegger says. Ultimately, Derrida recognizes the site is not a place or a locale in which one settles, a place of stability. The site is a departure, already a difference. Unquote. This, of course, applies to Heidegger's text as well, this law. Might there not be, then, a path between pure dispersion on the one hand and this notion of a gathering around the one on the other? Would be one question that I would like to dwell on to finish. Derrida seems to indicate the possibility of such path a path between two impossible, I thought, thinking of Lacan here, but perhaps also a path between the two deaths that I get Geschlecht II, when Derrida writes the following: if there were only gathering, the same, the unique, the side without path, this would be death. And this is not what Heidegger means, since he also insists on movement, on the journeying of the stranger, the journey towards others, etc. It must be that between sight and non-sight, between gathering and divisibility, difference, the relationship is otherwise. There must be a sort of negotiation or compromise that is ceaselessly ongoing, something that would oblige us to reconstitute the implicit logic that appears to guide Heidegger. To say that there is divisibility doesn't amount to saying there is only divisibility or division. This too would be death. Death lies in wait on both sides, with the phantasm of the integrity of the proper place and the innocence of a sexual difference without war. And also on the opposite side, that of impropriety or radical expropriation, even of a war of Geschlecht as sexual discord or dissension. Could it then be that on this point, Heidegger and Derrida are closer than it would seem? Could it be that on this path or on this journey, Heidegger and Derrida are fellow travelers, or as they say in French, compagnons de route? Thank you.
Thank you very much, François. I'd like to open the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, François. And congratulations for getting through that with your cold. And coincidentally, I had just called up in my PDF version of Geschlecht, because it's word searchable, that very passage that you ended on, because I realized that for 2 days now we've been talking back and forth, polycythemia and dissemination, and it's the term negotiation that I find most interesting, and it's one that Derrida uses actually quite frequently.
Yes.
I believe, though, it's the only time it occurs in Geschlecht III, if my word search is correct. And yet it's very key, I think, just in the way you emphasized at the end. Negotiation and compromise. Negotiation and compromise that's constantly underway. It's not a one-time deal, right? That this is negotiated and now it's over but a constant negotiation. And this, in fact, there's a collection of, as you all know, a collection in English of Derrida's writings, more or less political writings, under the collective title Negotiations in the plural that Elizabeth Rottenberg put together. So I actually don't have a question. Maybe I simply want to say I'm glad you ended by quoting that, because I was going to if you didn't. But also, and you stopped your quotation right before another very interesting moment, and perhaps a kind of hapax as well in the seminar, when Derrida talks about phantasm and goes on to say, because you ended the quote, he has just spoken of the phantasm of the integrity of the proper place and the innocence of sexual difference without war, and on the other side, the phantasm again of a impropriety or radical impropriety or expropriation or even a war of Geschlecht as sexual dissension. And then he adds, I don't use this word phantasm lightly. And points to it as what he considers, he says, in truth, it's one of the most obscure concepts in psychoanalysis. Again, another notion that is fairly frequent in Derrida's texts as well, despite its being so obscure. But phantasm, for example, in the late writings on sovereignty, sovereignty is always, after a certain point, is always referred to as a phantasm. So perhaps this notion of phantasm can help us negotiate somewhat between what have gotten stuck in this rather rigid, as someone was saying a moment ago, opposition of kind of controlled gathering, polysemous, on the one hand, and a sort of utter dispersion and dissemination on the other. It's not a question, François, unless
thank you very much. I have to think more about the phantasm thing, but I'm sort of connecting this notion of phantasm with what Derrida talks in terms of dream of another sexual difference. He says he's dreaming of another sexual difference. He talks about desire quite a bit.
And in this very passage
very
that
moment.
you
Sorry,
quote.
Yes.
can I jump in here?
Sure.
Because
so, go ahead.
this, first of all, I've got a lot to say, but thank you for all of that. That was like beautifully laid out. But it's exactly in this moment and on that point of the sphere, that psychoanalysis gets brought in. And this is where Derrida observes that Heidegger, for once, even mentions psychoanalysis. So Heidegger goes to the regional discourse of psychoanalysis in order to disavow it. And here Derrida has a kind of twofold gesture of psychoanalysis at this very point of the spear where you are, which is, he says, on the one hand, Heidegger would have been able, I mean, this point of this spear, you know, Derrida is saying, well, this is kind of a phallic image, and he's saying the ironic Heidegger could have gotten, you know, away from this. He didn't say anything about it, but he says he doesn't. Right. He says he didn't say anything about it for good reason. He anticipated everything that psychoanalysis would have wanted to bring to this conversation, and basically said that's still in an oppositional, that's still in this regional discourse. I want to talk about a pre-dual sexual difference. So on the one hand, he gives it to Heidegger in point one, saying Heidegger was here before us, Heidegger was ironic. And on the other hand, he said, but there's always the chance that Heidegger couldn't see what is in front of his nose. And he said, and at that point, Derrida steps out and seems to be gesturing towards psychoanalysis as a way, and psychoanalysis is haunting this whole passage, as a way of saying, you know, here's Heidegger needing to cast this whole thing in a phallic image, and either he's got it all together, as it were, or he's blind to it. And then he says, and Rodrigo and I have talked about this, in either case, Heidegger wouldn't have minded. So even if it's in front of his face, Heidegger would still say, I don't care, because that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah. But let me get to my question to you, which is about...
Just one thing, if I can interject.
Yeah, sure.
So, but there is here a deconstruction of the idea of the site, of the phallus.
But that's what I wanted to ask about. Okay. Because your retelling, and I kind of agree with you, but your retelling of Geschlecht I, we totally agree. And then it's interesting that you go to that very passage of the threshold of pain, of the Unterschied in Die Sprache, and Derrida knows that passage intimately. He quotes that passage everywhere, not in Geschlecht III.
Right.
And you had to haul it in to bring in that. And there is a relationship between that passage in Die Sprache and the Schmerz and the stone and the petrification that goes from Die Sprache and the threshold, and what the petrification is, that is the joining that separates, the tear, the rift, and then the Stein that spricht in Die Sprache in Gedicht. And Derrida, who himself is pointing to those moments all the time, eliminates it completely.
He talks about it in of spirit, I believe.
He talks about it in obscurity. He also talks about it in G4. He talks about
Yes.
it in Le Tutto Tre Tutto. He talks about it everywhere
Absolutely.
except in Geschlecht III. And that would be the only place, it seems to me, in Geschlecht III, where Derrida himself could make a link from Geschlecht I to the question of sexual difference in Geschlecht III, and you did it. You were like, this is the way to do it. I did it too.
But maybe
We
he
both.
didn't do it strategically.
But that's my question then.
Yes.
My question
Maybe it
is,
was a strategic
if one was
decision.
asking the question of, then what is the strategy of not to have taken the path that you just did?
Yeah. Well, he's discussing the one, and he's sort of, thinking in terms of a gathering, right? Which is not what the text.
But
His
but
passion
that's then
shows.
pretty interesting,
I
right?
think so. And he recognizes it when he talks about after the, he talks about the divinity of the sex. But, he did not bring it up here. I don't know exactly, the condition for that, but he did not bring it up here. I immediately thought of it because here is a text where Heidegger addresses the notion of the one.
Exactly.
And understands it in terms of difference.
But there is a place that connects, but I'll be talking about it later, and that's in the rhetoric of Tragen and Austragen. So the connector
He
is.
does refer to that passage somewhere.
Yeah.
in
He
Geschlecht.
refers to it, but he doesn't thematize it.
There's no
What?
explicit discussion.
No, exactly. Which would be weird since sexual difference is his theme, right? So,
I've read it.
yeah.
But he does not, and maybe it's a strategic situation. I don't know.
We have a lot of questions on the floor. I want to make sure we get to them. We have Jeff, and then David, and Francesco.
Yeah, about the fellow traveller thing, which I think is
Another route.
it's obviously true. It's obviously true, but also that gets into something that Rodrigo mentioned yesterday about that tout contre. He's so close to Heidegger that he's tout contre. And that
Too close. Yeah.
and that difference that opens up there, I wondered if it might be approachable through the logic of what Derrida often calls necessary possibility, which is also a condition of impossibility. You mentioned some of this, right? So that what makes something possible also makes it impossible. And I was thinking of a passage in a text that I haven't read in many years, and I'm not sure if it's so much read these days, but it is about poetry. It's an early text on Jacques in L'écriture et les différences, where Derrida says something like, a poem always runs the risk of being meaningless, and it would be nothing without that risk. This is an aphoristic claim that a poem always runs the risk of being meaningless, and it would be nothing without that risk. So that necessary possibility of meaninglessness that's there in that early text associated with poetry, I suspect that that is not something that would be so easy to find in Heidegger. So the suggestion would be that
The risk.
the risk, the essential risk, right? He has that fantastic formulation of it in Geschlecht III, which I think Francesco was mentioning, where he says, it's a wonderful aphorism again, where he says, si l'essence est accidentable, elle est a priori accidentée. It's a fabulous formulation of that necessarily, possibly not. That's part of Derrida's general logic, I think. If we really did the logic, we'd have the trace stuff, and then we'd probably have this necessary possibility of, or necessarily possibly not stuff. So letters necessarily possibly don't arrive at their destination. Performatives necessarily possibly can misfire. And that way of including an apparent negative accidental feature as a positive condition of possibility maybe seems to me to be a signature, if I can put it that way, Derridian thought that perhaps is not to be found, at least in those forms in Heidegger. And the way that might show up, and then I'll stop, in the quotations you gave from Was heißt denken, where Heidegger talks about multiplicity being the element of thought. That's still, from a Derridian point of view, within a horizon of meaning and interpretation, right? It's still essentially, in a very broad sense, a semantic hermeneutic situation. When Derrida's very insistent in a passage I mentioned and a couple of places about how dissemination crève, bursts or tears or breaks the semantic horizon, he's clearly gesturing towards that kind of meaningless that a poem always necessarily courts, a non-interpretable zone, a non-meaningful zone. We're no longer within the horizon of even the meaning of being, right? And that feels as though maybe there's something between the fellow travelers on that kind of point, that I'm not sure that necessarily, possibly not logic, as Derrida formulates it, is something that you can find formulated as such in Heidegger.
Okay, it's a very rich question. Let me just say a few things. First of all, about being tout contre, it's an interesting expression. In the interview with Janico, Derrida says that Heidegger is like un contremaître to him. Contremaître, I don't know how to render that in English, under the pun. Against whom one thinks. And he says, contremaître, un surveillant, un patron, un petit chef. Somebody who hovers above me, he says, like a superego. So Derrida is a rebellious son against Father Heidegger. Anyway, another play on contremaître and tout contre. Then I thought of something which I always found striking. I always found Derrida distancing himself from Heidegger. It's the same gesture, always distancing. And I'm thinking, in the expression tout contre, maybe he's too close. Why would you want to distance yourself constantly? So I'm wondering whether Derrida doesn't feel too close to Heidegger in some sense. With the notion of accident, it's a beautiful sentence, but I have a little bit of a doubt. If something is accidenté, therefore intrinsically, right? Intrinsically. Well, then you're inscribing the accident in your being. You almost want to say, leave the accident outside, happen to you. So, and a lot of accidents happen to Heidegger from the outside.
But he's saying that insofar as the accident is even possible, the essence must be such that it is accidentable.
But
and that affects the very definition of a priori accidenté.
Right.
That affects the very definition of accident. So the claim is that this is a deconstruction of the opposition between essence and accident, which he seems to be suggesting Heidegger still buys into, and which he, Derrida, thinks is a metaphysical opposition.
Well, one quick thing at the end. I think you can find in Heidegger many instances of risk of meaninglessness, that things come to mind. In Being and Time, of course, you have the whole limit cases of presence at hand for Hunt and Hyde, which are examples of meaninglessness. But being itself, the meaning of being, for Heidegger, is always in withdrawal. So that, in a sense, there's a kind of, if you want to say it's meaninglessness. But I think you can say that in Heidegger too, thinking is an adventure with meaninglessness. He says in Later Humanism, we have to learn how to remain in the nameless. A nameless, thinking about translation. Thinking as translation of the nameless. There's a risk there, perhaps, but I can't.
David?
I was full of admiration for the way you took us back through Heidegger's essay to the moment of the more gentle twofold. But then there's another series of 4 or 5 pages where Heidegger breaks that down further into what he calls das Knabenhafte und das Mädchenhafte, boyishness and girlishness. And I wondered why you didn't talk about that, and thinking back to it, is there anything about that analysis that would trouble you? What Heidegger, in other words,
boyishness and girlishness.
Just saying it quickly, das Mädchenhafte becomes reduced to what Heidegger calls das Knabenhafte. That's the meaning of little children. They're all little boys. They're either tomboys or real boys.
Yes.
But isn't that a strange way to preserve the twofold?
Yes. That I must go back to it and read it again. I haven't spent. I should have, but I didn't.
Okay.
I'll go back
Okay. Thank you.
and look at that again. Yes. a lot to be said about childhood in that text,
Mhm.
and I didn't really spend enough time on it. There's a lot there on childhood.
We have time for a final question from Francesca.
Yes, Derrida is always close to Heidegger when he reads. Heidegger is close to Husserl when he reads. Husserl is close to Hegel when he reads Hegel, but there is a moment or a little place where he completely diverges.
Yes.
And I think it is in Heidegger, I think, or at least in this seminar, in this text that come from a seminar that we have to recall, is about nationalité, nationalism, philosophy.
Yes.
The divergence is that Heidegger is following the phantasm of the Heimat.
Yes.
Derrida, not at all. Derrida says that, thinks that this is the most dangerous phantasm, to believe that there is an Heimat that in this case, yes, it's not a site, it's not a geographical point or a geometrical point.
Yes.
It's the idiom, the German
Yes.
idiom. No? And I think this is more or less clear. In the seminar, it's very clear. And in the seminar, the year after, the other one, is he speaks about an archaic phantasm of autochthony as we could say the origin of this phantasm that is already in Athens, that is at the origin of Western culture and in the main place, not Athens, the classical Athens. Then I think that yes, they are on the same path, but Derrida is going in another direction, as always. No?
It depends how you read Heidegger's notion of sight. If you read it, as I try to do at the end, as journeying in the foreign, then they are closer than it may seem. The phantasm is the phantasm of a metaphysical home, Heimat. That is a phantasm. But the motion towards it may be something completely different. At least that's what Derrida helps us understand in Heidegger himself. That's why at the end it didn't end up being so far. After everything, you go back to sort of an interesting between threshold, perhaps, between them. So a journey. But on the notion of the phantasm, yes, you're absolutely correct in this.
Can I just add one
Yes.
sentence? That in his late work on sovereignty, and Derrida says that the mother of all phantasms is the phantasm of the mother, and the mother is the Heim. So that's just a
He says the mother of all phantasm is the mother.
And the mother is the Heim.
as the Heim. That's why I'm saying this.
And here
But
the Heim is
Exactly,
Muttersprache.
exactly. So that's just which would go back. So.
Let's thank François for. In order to